Our final speaker was privileged to meet her and her husband when they moved to our district, that they're ministers in our district, and found out what she was, and again, it was one of those multiple contacts during this time. I found out that she's a PhD in education. Oh, and by the way, she works as a CASA representative with court-appointed special advocates for children of abuse. I mean, my mind was just going, over the past 2 years, I go, well, okay, I'll see if she's willing to close out our session today with a legal response. But she's a licensed educator. She also dedicated nearly 15 years serving in instructional administrative positions, local public schools, higher education, faith-based ministries. And now she's a CASA director, executive director of CASA, which, like I said earlier, is a court-appointed special advocates for the region, where, and I'm probably going to get all this wrong, I had to ask her, now tell me again what CASA stands for. But she represents, and her team represents children that go to court, so that child doesn't have to face a family court issue by themselves, and they represent that child and follow through with that. So let's give a warm South Texas welcome to Dr. Kimberly Stephens. Would you like to hold this or put it? Okay, God bless you.
I'm short, I have to hold it.
Okay.
Home stretch. I didn't bring candy, so I already feel like a little disadvantaged. Hopefully you can bear with me here at the end, though. As Brother Don said, I'm the executive director of CASA, which does stand for Court Appointed Special Advocates. It's a nationwide program of 501c3 nonprofit that focuses on recruiting and training and supporting community volunteers to represent children as they enter the CPS system. Our volunteers spend time getting to know each of those children. They follow along their education, their medical, their progress, so that hopefully by having those additional eyes and ears before the judge, a lot of the horror stories that we hear about what happens to children when they enter foster care can be prevented. Long time before that, though, my passion for working with families in crisis, it goes back to my childhood. I am not only married to a minister, I am a PK, and I'm not your traditional PK. My family was very missions focused. My sister and I, we used to joke that when my parents would plant a new church, they didn't do it like normal people. They didn't pull up a map and, study the demographics, but they would drive up and down the streets and they would look for the most dilapidated, trashy, dirty, the part of town you double lock your doors, and they'd say, that's where we're going. And they'd look at us and they'd say, all right, girls, get out. And we would get out and we would minister in those areas. My family really emphasized for me the role of the community when it comes to being involved in each other's lives, in intervening in crisis situations. I can remember as a little girl many, many times that we would beat the officers to the scene of a domestic event that had tragic ending, or an addiction that had created a chaos in a home. And I would sit in the back seat of the car and I would watch the doors for my mom to come out of those houses, most of the time with children in hand, because before CPS even got there, she was already mobilizing a task force. Where's this child going to go for the night? What's going to happen? Where can we locate relatives? And she was basically doing what I get to do now for a career. And while I hate that the need exists, I'm honored that God trusts me with it. Because of my conviction that the community plays such a role in intervening in each other's lives, when I grew up, I decided to launch out in the field of education, because I thought as a teacher, what better place to impact my city than the children? And I believe I did a lot of good work as a teacher for over 15 years. I loved what I got to do, but I learned very, very early on that it was difficult to fulfill my professional responsibilities while also remaining true to my calling. And a lot of times I would have to be very creative with working outside of the scope of my job, if you will, because I knew that if I wanted to impact that child and really change their life, then I had to touch the home. And I would do drive-bys after hours just to see who was parked at Johnny's house, just to see if Mary's parents had gotten home yet or if she was home alone yet again. And I had to be very sneaky almost with getting that information because I knew that my children, my students, they deserve somebody in their corner who was there with their eyes open, who wasn't going to look away, who wasn't going to hope and pray and believe that it didn't happen there, but was very aware that there are dark things that happen in dark places, and those things thrive when we refuse to look at them. After a few years in education, though, I did feel God stirring on my heart to make a transition to come and work for CPS. That was a huge move for us when you dedicate half your life to a career field and you suddenly feel God pulling you a different direction. It's a big, big commitment and decision, but I know that God ordered those steps. Working for CPS allowed me to access information that I thought would be more intuitive than it really was. As a teacher, you're a mandated reporter in all 50 states, meaning that anytime you suspect child abuse or neglect, you are by law required to report it. Because of my experiences as a teacher, I thought, okay, when I work for CPS, I'm going to be working with the same kids. I know what I'm looking for. I've been through this for years, yada, yada, yada. This isn't going to be that difficult. But it was a major aha moment for me to come out of a classroom where a small percentage of my student population was dealing with the trauma from abuse and neglect, to entering a court system where 100% of the clients that you deal with, this is their life. And then when I realized just how pervasive this epidemic was in the Houston area, it was very eye-opening for me. I've shared the statistics with some of you guys, but I supervise the region, Liberty, Chambers County. It's 2,000 square miles, everything to the east, basically, of Houston and Montgomery County. In that little area, which is very rural, it's not urban, it's not even suburban, it's just a rural farming community, we have over 70%, our intakes are higher than 70% of the rest of the state of Texas. So you don't have to go on the other side of the world to find families in crisis and to find the need. It's right here where we live. It's right here where we are. It's in your backyard. It's in your neighborhood. So coming to CPS, that was the big aha, where I realized just how prevalent this epidemic was. And that led me to my current career path, because when I was first exposed to CASA in a courtroom, I fell in love with the fact that it was the community in action. And that took me all the way back to my childhood roots with ministry. I saw teachers and neighbors and friends and aunties and people just from all walks of life rising up and saying, okay, we're going to do something about this. We're not just going to sit idly by, but we're aware that this is a problem in our community and we're going to be proactive in addressing it. And I love that that mission and that attitude exists in this organization. Through my work with CASA, though, we look for partnerships with faith-based organizations and with churches. I am surprised sometimes by how off the radar childhood abuse and neglect is for a lot of ministries and a lot of churches. The lack of knowledge, the lack of proactivity, the lack of willingness or even ability to engage. It's just not a priority, and it can be a little disheartening. So I'm hopeful that for all the information that's shared today, you guys are able to take away some really good tools and start a revival in your area that says, no more. We're not going to sit with blind eyes, and we're not going to let this thing, this evil grow in our pews and in our Sunday school classrooms, not while we're here. So I wanted to start, I'm not sure who's running our slides, but I wanted to start with mandated reporting. I used that term a second ago. I'm not sure how many of you guys are familiar with that, but that just means that you're required by law to report any suspicion that you have of childhood abuse and neglect. The interesting thing about reporting as it relates to your position is this concept right here of clergy penitent privilege. A lot of you guys have heard about attorney-client privilege or medical confidentiality, and some of you may even be aware that by law, anything that is stated to you in the context of you fulfilling your clergy duties, your ministerial roles, it does have some level of confidentiality. And according to a recent Pew Center research report, the number one reason that ministers do not come forward with their suspicions, it has to do with this privilege. They believe that something that was shared for them, well, that was shared in confidence. So I don't necessarily have to act on that, nor can I act on that. I can't tell anyone that. However, all 50 states have some level of law that pertains to professionals, including clergy, being reporters, and specifically in 4 states, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, and Texas, clergy penitent privilege is denied when it is related to child abuse. That means that if you have anyone, in confidence or not, that shares any information with you that causes you to suspect that child abuse or neglect could be occurring, then you can and will be held liable for that information. Children are precious in the eyes of God. I think we all agree that. I believe we have a very powerful responsibility to love and protect children the way that God loves and protects us as his children. Whether you are a mandated reporter or not, I think best practice is always to report. I know we hear stories sometimes of people that they'll tell us about, oh, CPS got called on me for that, or CPS showed up because my sister-in-law said this. Can you believe that? And I get those kind of things that come to me all the time, and my response is always the same. While that's an inconvenience for you, if nothing's going on, you don't have anything to worry about. But I would rather a few people be inconvenienced to stop a crisis for many, many, many children. So I encourage you to call it in. And if we look at the number of abuse and neglect cases or reports that were made in Texas last year, almost 500,000 reports, less than 0.2% were made by a minister. That's less than half of 1%. With 28% of children attending church, that is a very small fraction of ministers that are catching what's happening in these families. You need to be aware that if you are not reporting, there are very serious consequences. That includes civil liability and criminal liability. Civil means that victims of child abuse can come back years later and sue you for failing to report if they believe you had knowledge of abuse or neglect happening. And in Texas, that has happened. Criminal prosecution means that a minister who is a mandated reporter, they could face possible criminal prosecution for not complying with their state's mandated reporting laws. And specific to Texas, all persons, clergy or otherwise, that fail to report suspected abuse or neglect, it's a Class B misdemeanor punishable by imprisonment of up to 1 year and a $4,000 fine. Not to mention that now you have a criminal record for failing to act. So what do you need to know to be able to fulfill your responsibilities and avoid that legal risk? Well, the first thing has to do with keeping your eyes and your ears open. Dr. Harry talked just a minute ago about an outcry, and I chose this picture intentionally because this one is so similar to the ones that we see a lot in media where the child is helpless. A lot of times we see images of children where they're holding up signs that say stop, or they have tape across their mouth that says help. In reality, an outcry rarely looks like we expect it to look, and it rarely sounds like we expect it to sound, because children love their parents. And if that's the world they grew up in, that's the only world they know. I have never, in the hundreds of cases that I've had a single child that wanted to be taken from their home. And even once they were removed and they were deep in the therapeutic process where we're dealing with that trauma and they're understanding why it was that they had to be removed, 9 times out of 10, when they turn 18 years old, the first thing they want to do is go back to mom and dad. It's a very traumatic thing to be taken from their home. So if they have been told, you can't tell anybody this, then they're going to guard that very carefully. So that outcry may not sound like the child coming up and saying, please help me, you don't know what's going to happen when I get home. That outcry may sound more like statements that are inconsistent with what you think would be proper or normal. A lot of times it comes back to a gut instinct and discernment where you just pick up on pieces and start connecting dots. You have to keep your spirit open and your eyes open for those things. One of my first cases with CPS, one of my first days out in the field, I was shadowing with another caseworker. We went into a home that was supposed to just be an easy, quick in and out. We were at the end of this case. Parents had had substance abuse issues they had dealt with, 2 little boys, 3 and 5, precious children. Every visit we were having was just going so well. The kids had already been returned to mom and dad. They were on what we call a monitored return home. And so we were basically watching them for so many months until the judge could close the case. Mom and dad are testing clean, holding down a job, stable housing. We're good. The kids are healthy. But the CASA advocate called into the CPS office and said, I just feel strange every time in this house. Will you do a couple drive-bys? So we paid a couple of unannounced visits, and the first time, no one came to the door even though the car was there. The second time we went up to the apartment and you could hear a TV on until we knocked on the door and then it was silent. The third day that we went back, we intended to keep knocking until somebody came to the door, or else we were going to call law enforcement to do a well-child check with us. So we stood there and knocked and knocked and knocked, and about 5 minutes later, sure enough, the dad came to the door and he opened and he looked outside and he said, oh, I'm sorry, I was napping. I've got to go put my pants on. So he closes the door, takes him 5 minutes to run all 300 square feet of this apartment to get pants and come back. So it was an odd timeline for it to take that long. So we kind of had some red flags. There might be something going on inside the walls when we get in there. He finally let us in the house. We explained that because we were at the end of the case, we were going to have to update some case file photos. Our clients know what that means. It means we go room to room taking pictures. We open cabinet doors. We look in the refrigerator. Is there food? Is there running water? Are the lights on and off? Is it a normal temperature in the home? We check everything. So as we're going room to room, in one particular room, I noticed a strange pile of bedding, and the bed was unmade. I didn't really think much of it because a lot of people don't make up their beds and bedding just gets tossed off in the floor. But something just didn't feel right. We got back in the car and I thought, all right, Holy Spirit, my caseworker that I'm shadowing is going to think I'm crazy, but I can't let this go. I don't know what you're dropping in my spirit, but something's not right. Open my eyes and reveal this to me. And I told the caseworker next to me, something's not right. I know we went in every room. I know we opened every cabinet, but I feel like we need to go in again. And as she and I were thinking through the floor plan, we realized that in one of the rooms, he had left a light off as he ushered us in, and with his body had kind of obstructed a door that we had missed. So we knocked back on the door, same routine, 5 minutes to come, 5 minutes to come back out, lets us back in. He told us that his children had been away with grandparents on a vacation, so he was home alone in the apartment. We went room to room to room, and when I got to the end of the hallway, I just felt the Holy Spirit say, check there again, go there one more time. And I went in and opened that closet door and found 2 little boys undressed, with an undressed woman who was not their mother wrapped in a blanket. And I looked at the faces of a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old silent in a closet and thought, I could have missed this. Mom and Dad did test positive that next drug test for heroin and cocaine. We were able to get those children to safety. But that child's outcry didn't look or sound like an outcry. Pay attention to those small voices. Pay attention to the Holy Spirit as he's dropping something. If something doesn't seem right, dig a little deeper. Don't just let it rest. Dig a little deeper. If you need to make a report for abuse or neglect, Section 2261 of the Texas Family Code mandates that anyone who suspects child abuse or neglect must report it immediately. The report can be made to any local or state law enforcement agency or the Department of Family and Protective Services. If you believe that you have an emergency that is life-threatening, you need to call 911 or local law enforcement. Do not do the 1-800 number. If it is immediate, get law enforcement on the scene. If you believe that your situation is urgent and needs to be investigated in the next 24 hours, that's when you call the child abuse hotline, which is the 1-800-252-5400. It's on your card. If you forget it, a quick Google search will bring that up every time. If you believe that it is not urgent, but it is still something that you want to report because there's some suspicion there, there is an online reporting portal. It's txabusehotline.org, and you can make a report there either in your name or anonymously. And we'll talk about the difference between those two in just a moment. But the thing I want you to pay attention to is that you have to make some sort of report. In Texas, notifying a supervisor, so if you're a youth pastor and you go to your senior pastor, if you're a senior pastor and you take it to the district, that is not sufficient under state law to stop there and satisfy your reporting requirements. So you are still at risk if you did not participate in making that report. So how do we know if it is urgent or not? The 24-hour rule. If it pertains to a serious injury, if the injury is occurring to a child aged 5 years or younger, if there's an immediate need for medical treatment, and that includes suicidal thoughts, sexual abuse where the abuser has or will have access to the victim within the next 24 hours, children aged 5 and under who are alone or likely to be left alone in the next 24 hours, or any time you believe your situation requires action in less than 24 hours. And one thing that you'll see a lot in our legal terms have to do with the concept of age 5 and younger. That's for a couple different reasons. One, those children are at a very tender developmental age, so any sort of physical injury or blow to that child has a greater likelihood of being detrimental or to a more serious degree. Number 2, these are not school-aged children, which means if that child is not in a daycare or in the care of others through the day, you don't have any other eyes and ears on that child. Versus a school-aged child, if they go to school, there is some reprieve where they're going to be in the care of someone else who is safe and who is appropriate. So what exactly do we report when we make that report or when we call it in? What exactly is it that we're looking for? Texas law broadly defines abuse and neglect so that every action in which a child's physical or mental health or their welfare may have been or has been adversely affected, all of those are potentially covered. The statute explicitly excludes accidents or reasonable discipline by a parent or guardian that does not expose the child to substantial risk. The state of Texas does protect a parent's right to physically discipline. I know we have a lot of urban legend about spanking, and when I was a CPS caseworker, that was the first thing people wanted to tell me when they learned my job was, oh, well, I spanked my kids. And I'd say, well, I spanked mine, so we're okay. But that's the running joke culturally, socially. But Texas does recognize your right to spank your children if that's how you want to discipline. And even to some degree, and this is a little disappointing to me, but it's the law, to some degree, bruising is even allowed if it's considered a non-essential body part. So the degree to which abuse had to go for a case to come into CPS care, into the custody of the state, is to a level of profound that a lot of times I don't think that a layperson appreciates if you've not walked through that. I know I certainly didn't until I knew more about the system. We hear stories all the time of people that they say, well, I just did this and my kids were taken away. And they minimize what it must have been. However, to meet the statutory standard, the rigor that's held there, I can tell you that if that's the narrative they're telling you, you don't have all of the information, or the judge would have never allowed the department to take custody. Does that make sense? Very, very rarely did I have parents who were honest with their extended circle, with their family members, with other people in their network. And so when we would come together with a family team meeting, it was very common for grandma to suddenly lash out and say, I don't even know why you have these kids or why you haven't given these kids back, because they didn't do anything. So if you're getting a story from someone that's involved in your congregation, but you want information for what is happening in that case, it is confidential unless the parents sign off on it, with one caveat. If you attend a hearing, which are publicly announced, if you attend open court sessions on court days, then you can hear the testimony as it's given before the judge. So if there is a situation for some reason that you just need to know more about what's going on here, that's a way to get that information, is to be present for the court hearings. Another thing I want you to pay attention to when it comes to making a report is that the state of Texas defines abuse and neglect as both acts and omissions. So a lot of times we have people that wait to make a report because they think, well, I haven't seen anything, or I don't know that this is for sure happening. But if a parent is failing to act in a way that keeps a child safe, that gives you grounds for suspicion. So you should still be making that report. If it happened a long time ago, that's a lot of times another question that I get. Criminal charges of felony aggravated sexual assault, continuous sexual assault, abuse of a child, indecency with a child, and trafficking, criminal charges of those nature can be commenced at any time, and there is no statute of limitations. So if you have someone that brings a situation like that to your awareness, it's never too late to make that call. The statute of limitations on the state bringing criminal charges for injury to a child is 10 years from the child's 18th birthday and 5 years from the date of the event for child endangerment. If you have doubts or you're not sure if it's abuse, I encourage you to call the hotline. They will walk you through that process. So when you call the hotline, another question that I often get asked is, what information do I have to give them, and will any of that come back on me? If you call the hotline with information that you believe you are providing in good faith, the law says that if you are acting in good faith or assisting an investigation in good faith, that you are immune from any civil or criminal liability, even if you're incorrect. However, If a person is reporting their own acts of abuse or neglect against a child, or who is acting in bad faith with a malicious purpose, that same immunity does not apply. Your reporter identity is held in the highest level of confidentiality by law. Even if court ordered to do so, even if the information is subpoenaed by the court, CPS cannot reveal the reporter's identity. Statewide intake, which is the person who will take your information when you make your report, they'll ask for your information, and that's optional. The CPS personnel, including investigations worker, and the case, if it's opened by the caseworkers, those three are the only ones that will have access to your identity. But again, there are harsh legal consequences if they fail to preserve that confidentiality. Providing your name and contact information, though, I highly encourage that. Even though anonymity is allowed, the more information statewide intake has when you make that initial report, it lets them establish two things. One, that you have an actual relationship to an actual living child and have credible information, meaning you're not just somebody in Walmart that saw somebody else and they're never going to be able to investigate this because they don't know who you're talking about. But it also lets them establish that you would have a relationship that's close enough to the child that if they follow up, it's going to give them what they need to be able to make a determination. So I encourage you to provide your contact information, because the first step that happens after you make a report, statewide intake then sends it to an investigations unit if and only if they believe there's going to be enough information to investigate. And without your name and contact number, there's no real way for them to make that kind of determination, or it's very difficult for them to make that kind of determination. So the question of remaining anonymous is a very personal decision. If investigations call you after you've made a report and you provide additional information from that time about the situation, at that point, anything that you give to CPS could be included in court documents or in testimony before the court. So at that point, all of that extra that you provide means that your identity could be revealed as someone that said this or told that, but not as the initial reporter. That question of remaining anonymous, though, it comes into play because if you remained anonymous during your report, of course, they can't follow up with you on all of those questions. Partial names, addresses, dates of birth, all of those are useful information if you can secure that, and that helps with locating the people that are involved. Even if you just have an approximate age or a street name, that's sufficient enough for us to go on usually to start an investigation. So whatever information you can gather on the front end is going to help with that reporting process. So the question is then, what happens next? When a suspected abuser is someone other than the child's parents or guardians, the police department is typically who conducts that investigation. If your information does not meet the definition of abuse or neglect according to the Texas Family Code, then the report will not be sent to the local office for investigations. This happens sometimes, and what I would like to say to that is that if you have a credible report that you know I've turned this in and nothing happened, you can re-report it. It doesn't have to stop there. So if you feel like maybe more information has come forward, nothing happened last time, don't use that as a crutch or an excuse to not re-report it. I hear people say from time to time, yeah, but I turned it in last time and then they didn't do anything. Or, yeah, but I made the report and then nothing happened. If you have more information, or again, you believe your suspicion to be credible, turn it in again. Sometimes just having a different investigator look at the information can change a case outcome, just because what they have to work with when they compare it to statutory definitions with Texas Family Code, they might be able to make a different determination just because it's a different set of eyes looking at it and gathering that information. So looking at the process, the flow chart here, when an initial report comes in, we're starting at the top left. When a report comes in, the first thing that is determined is whether or not there is a risk to the child or there is not a risk to the child. They're not necessarily immediately looking for whether or not we believe it has occurred at that point. If we believe there is a threat for something to be ongoing, this really comes into play in situations with domestic violence. If we believe that, let's say mom was the victim, dad was a perpetrator, the child was at risk while being in the home, but mom has since left and has now checked herself into a shelter. If CPS gets that call at that point, they are going to determine that there's not a risk, mom is being protective, and she's taken proactive actions to establish safety for her child. So at that point, a case is not initiated. If there is a risk indicated, then we have to determine, is the child still safe to stay in the home? Sometimes a child is okay to still stay with parents. I had a case that we had a sibling that was a perpetrator. We were able to remove the sibling, but the victims were able to stay with mom and dad. Sometimes that is the case, and if that is the case, then we have something called FBSS, Family-Based Social Services, and we also have something called Alternative Response. Those are the top two tiers of CPS services, if you will. They're the least restrictive. That means that the case is never actually entered before the court, and services are not court-ordered. But don't let that fool you that participation is voluntary, because it's not. Parents are basically asked to agree and to consent at that time to make safety plans and put safe practices in place that are addressing the issues that cause the case to be open. If that is sufficient, then the case starts and stops there. A lot of times we see this in cases where the parents, perhaps because of a financial issue, were not able to provide food or clothing or provide for the child's physical needs. So we're able to just connect the parent with resources, and it's open and closed at that point. However, if the child is not able to stay safe in their home, then we have to look at an emergency placement. Everything from this level down kind of relates to, I'm going to do my best to explain this because Texas Family Code is thousands of pages that we're boiling down to like 10 minutes. Everything from that point, though, is based on a series of permanency goals or outcomes that we would like to see for that child. And the number one in the state of Texas is always family reunification. Regardless of the situation and the background, the number one thing that we always have to shoot as a target is family reunification. CPS is not an adoption agency. They're not interested in keeping children forever. The goal is to rehabilitate and then return home, if at possible, to keep that family unit intact. And if that's not with mom and dad, the next closest thing would be with kinship. That can be biological kin or it can be fictive kin. Sometimes we have an auntie who she's been there for every Christmas and birthday, but she's not related. At some point, she just came alongside this family and became like family. And the law treats those relationships the same. So if at all possible, when we have an emergency placement, we look for a relative. If there's not a relative available, this is when we look for substitute care. Substitute care is when we enter, technically, the foster care system. While the child is in substitute care, a plan is put in place for both mom and dad. And this parenting plan basically walks the parents through exactly what is expected in order to achieve that permanency outcome that we set. So if we're working towards family reunification, we might have things like parenting classes, drug assessments, random drug testing, counseling, full psychological evaluation, and whatever services are indicated as a result of that. And during the time that the child is in foster care, these parents are expected to be working these services. These services are provided free of charge through the state. We get them hooked up with providers, and so all they have to do is basically show up and check these things off the list while we monitor these. And in an ideal outcome, that's exactly what happens. The parents check these off, and the children are able to return home safely. Sometimes that is not what happens, and parents are either unable or unwilling to complete these services. And that's the point at which we start looking at the bottom two levels, the bottom right level. At that point, we look for the child's eligibility for adoption, or we look at PMC, which is permanent managing conservatorship to the state. These are the stories you hear of children that were in foster care for life. These are the ones who remain in the system, if you will. From start to finish, from the report all the way to the bottom two, either reunification or permanent custody, we are looking at a 1-year clock, sometimes a 1.5 years because you can get a 6-month extension. It is not supposed to extend past that point, although I will say in very rare circumstances, we have had a second extension granted in this area where it's gone to 24 months. But you're looking at a 1-year clock. That's 12 months to address every issue that caused that child to come into care. That's 12 months to address what could have been 12 years of trauma. And that's 12 months to address what could have been 40 years of parents' trauma. Someone talked earlier about the cycles of abuse and neglect, and that's something that that's nationwide. Every statistic regurgitates that and confirms it. We know that if it started with this generation, it's very, very likely to keep going until there's an intervening force. It doesn't stop on its own. It's just recreated. And again, that's what I love about the organization that I get to be a part of now. And what excites me about conferences such as this one, because it's an opportunity for clergy and for the community to come in and say, we're going to do something different. So thank you so much for your time.